What's up, bros, and welcome to another Brograph tutorial. I'm Dave Koss, and today I wanted to talk about using RSMB the correct way. Matt and I actually kind of have a funny thing going back and forth about RSMB, but a lot of people like to use RSMB by just throwing RSMB Pro right on top of whatever they're doing. But sometimes you run into issues with that. Now, I'm going to show you a couple tips on this, and I'm sure I've mentioned this before, and I've talked about the correct way to use RSMB, and I've actually used it in a tutorial before, but you don't want to have to watch a whole tutorial just to find that one thing, so I figured I would separate this out into its own tutorial. So the first thing that I'm going to do is create a simple animation of some text so that we can actually see how this works. Now, I'm just going to write, I don't know, Brograph. Okay, easy enough, right? And I'm just because I'm going to change the font to Gotham, just because, you know, Gotham. There it is. All right, Brograph. Thinking of something easy to do in here, just to get a little motion. You know what? Let's do a formula effector, and instead of where are my parameters here? Instead of affecting scale, we're just going to affect, how about Y and Z motion? No, X motion. We'll do that. Okay, there we go. Brograph, it's dancing around, it's fun. I'm going to create a camera, and I'm going to keyframe it so that it does not move. There we go. Now, I hit Command B to go to my render settings. What do we need in order to do RSMB correctly? Well, we need to output our entire project when we render all frames 0 to 90, and we're going to save. And if you've watched my folder structure tutorials before, you'll see that I have a place that I always put everything in the exact same spot for every project. Cinema 4D, render folder, and it's going to be called render. And I'm going to copy that. I'm going to paste it down here to my multipass image, so we have the same path for everything. Now, in the multipass, I'm going to render out a motion vector. And if you don't already have that in there, like I do for my preset, you go to multipass, and it will be in this list here. Now, you can also add stuff like depth and other render passes. So my multipass is going to render out motion vector as well as the base render. It's also going to do an object buffer, and we're going to get to that in a second. So I'm going to go ahead and render to my render farm. So hopefully this will go pretty quick. All right, there we go. Got a little animation going here, and I'm going to bring that into After Effects. So I'm going to my folder. Where are you at? RSMB, graphics, Cinema 4D, render. Here we go. Here is my motion pass. Make sure it's on TIFF sequence. Got my motion pass imported. And then I'm going to go in and get the render pass, base render pass. So if I drop my render into a new comp, I can see it there. I can turn on my alpha channel and see my alpha channel. I'm also going to take my motion pass and put that in its own comp so that I can see it. Okay, you can see the different colors here are based on the relative speed of those objects, and that basically is going to tell RSMB how much blur to put on something. The only thing about this is there's no alpha channel on here. Now if we go back to our main render, and we do what a lot of people do, RSMB, we'll put RSMB Pro, not the Pro Vectors, but the Pro, onto this render. And now we'll see what the result is. There we go. So we go through here, and I'm going to turn off the transparency just so we can see. Now there's motion blur going on. Now, depending on how complex your animation is and your scene is, you're going to get some weird things going on depending on where you are. in your animation and how complex it is. Like the side of this P right here is looking kind of funky. You get some kind of weirdness going on in some of the pieces of the letters. See, that looks a little funky. Now, the funkiness depends on how much other stuff is in the scene, again. But I'm going to show you how to correct this and make your blurs look more realistic. See, like right here, this is frame 71. I've got some weirdness going on in here. This is because RSMB is just making an estimation. It's just guessing at which direction everything is going. Unless you actually bring in that motion pass and that vector pass, it doesn't really know what the real velocities were and the directions were of the object that you brought in. So if you go back to your render motion, you have to create a transparency on the vector motion, and here's why. If we go back to our main render and we delete RSMB Pro and we bring up the Pro vectors instead, you'll get red here. That's because you don't have your motion pass. If I just bring in the base motion pass and just throw it in here, and then I tell RSMB to use that as the motion pass, you're going to get weirdness going on around the sides. See, like these aren't going in the right direction. It looks all blurry, like out of focus. Just doesn't look like the correct type of motion blur. That's because it has a black background on it. And I don't understand why they don't render the pass or give you the option to render the pass with an alpha channel. But here's how you go about fixing that. Under your render motion project with the black background, you're going to go into your project here, and here's the render, the regular render, not the motion. You're going to put it on top of that motion pass, and then you're going to use that as an alpha channel. That way you've got your alpha. But here's the problem. You get these like 1 pixel of black around everything. There's an easy fix to that. Because that will mess up your RSMB and your regular comp. You go in and just do a choke. And what's great about this is if you use a matte choker and you put it on your render, that adjusts the alpha channel. You don't have to change anything in your matte choker. It's all just generic. So matte choker is the best way to do that. And then the other thing that I found that really helps this is just to put on a level 3 fast blur, and it's exactly the same every time. This is how I use RSMB every time I use it. Always put the choker on with defaults, always put a fast blur on with 3. It just softens those edges just a bit, and it makes everything work real well in your regular comp. Now, I'm back in my regular comp, and it doesn't have a source for the motion vector now anymore. So I'm going to put that comp that we just created of render motion down in here, turn it off, we don't want to see it. Then back here in my effects controls for RSMB Pro vectors, I'm going to change this to the render motion comp. And now you can see that the motion for all of these is nice, it's smooth, it doesn't look distorted in any way, and when the different pieces pass each other, they don't get all funky. Like here now, you can actually see like the H and the P are not interfering with each other because it now has the correct vectors motion of every piece. Now there's one more thing I wanted to talk about today. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And I'll show you exactly how to fix this other issue that may come up. I'll call this RSMB. Now this is when you are creating a rather large scene that has stuff in it that is a background, stuff that is not moving as much as the foreground. You know, it's really easy to create some sort of a logo that has motion in it and do what we just did, but what if you're creating like a mountainscape and, you know, like in the previous tutorial, and you've got stuff passing the camera and you've got some letters flying through the mountainscape and all of that. You may run into problems where the foreground with RSMB kind of blurs the background in a way that you were not expecting. And here's how you get around that. So here's my scene, and let's say I have something going on in the background. This is like another piece of geometry or something. We'll say it's like a mountain or something. I don't know. So that's going to be going on in the background. And maybe there's some other geometry back here that's not moving. I'll put the old capsule back here. I'll put it right behind everything where it's actually going to get in the way of motion. There we go. So before I render this, I'm going to go to my texts and I'm going to add a compositing tag. And under object buffer, I'm going to tell it to enable object buffer 1. Then in my render settings, you may need to add this in your multipass, but I already have it in here, the object buffer with group ID 1. So we're going to render out object buffer 1 so that we can do some fixes later on. So I'm going to send that to the render farm, and then we'll wait a minute, and I'll be right back. So my render's done here. I'm going to go ahead and refresh the render, reload my footage. Now you'll see a problem here. If I zoom in, you see this weird edge thing going on. Something's not right. Something's changed. And if you go into render motion, into the other comp that we created, you can see what's going on. Now we have this color back here. And that's interfering with all our stuff that we have moving. And that's no good. So I'm going to go to my project, and in this bin here, I'm going to import the object buffer that we just made on the letters for Brograph. So you can see if I open this now that we have basically what our alpha channel looked like before, which is just the letters moving by itself. The only problem is there is no alpha channel in the object buffer, which is another thing that I wish they would add. So we're going to go in and just delete the original render that we had here that we were using for an alpha channel, and we're going to use the object buffer instead. Now what you think you would be able to do here is just say use a LumaMat instead of an alpha channel, which that does work. That gives you the cutout, kind of the alpha that we had before, except that you can't really put a choke on this and you can't put fast blur on it. So I'm going to go back to alpha, because if you don't know about setmat, you should learn about setmat. And here's how setmat works. If you throw a setmat on something that's black and white, and then you go up to use for matte and you say use the luminance for the matte, that creates an alpha channel out of the luminance. And the reason that this is great is because now you can use all the effects and filters that you would be using on something with an actual alpha channel. So for example, I could now put a choke onto this black and white image, and I can now put a fast blur on top of that, and it's actually using this alpha information. So I've put my regular choke and my level 3 fast blur on. And so now when I use alpha here and pull alpha from that layer, it's doing all the things that it did before, except now when I go back to my render, my blur looks correct because it has the correct channel. It's not trying to pull all of this information from these pieces that are not moving in the background. And so that really makes this blur look extremely realistic. And I'll play it back here for you. I should probably do it in higher res. You get the idea. Now it's doing the correct motion. Nothing else is getting distorted. And that is so much better than putting a just standard whatever fast RSMB Pro on something like this. If you want to see what it looks like, especially if you have a background, I'm going to delete this Pro Vectors for a second and show you. If I put a standard RSMB Pro onto this now, especially having other objects in the scene and a background and all of that, you'll see exactly what this does. Look what happens. Look at that. Why is that blurring right there? That doesn't make any sense. This is not blurring in the corner. It's blurring more up here. It's all funky looking. And that is why it is important to do RSMB Pro the correct way. So I hope this is helpful for you. If you're creating something using RSMB, I'd love to see it. Send it to me. Until next time, remember you can subscribe to our newsletter on our website, and we send stuff out very rarely, but you'll get that in your inbox, and we won't be too spammy about that. Just go to Brograph.com, and you can sign up for that, as well as look at all of our other tutorials and experiments and blogs and that kind of stuff. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and we're also in the Cinema 4D subreddit all the time. Well, not all the time, but every time we have a minute to go into the subreddit. And I think that's it. Is that all our social stuff? Oh, subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. That way you get everything as it's completed and it comes in. Right now, I'm in the middle of doing like a marathon of tutorials, so hopefully there'll be a lot of them coming up pretty soon. And until next time, have a good one. Later, bros. It's pretty good, I guess.